Broadcast is now starting. All attendees are in listen-only mode.
Good morning, everybody. It's Emily here, and today I'm joined by my colleague Christopher from the Improvement Service. So welcome to today's webinar. Today's webinar is on volunteer participation, and with us we've got George Thomson, and George is the CEO of Volunteer Scotland. So George is just going to chat to us about some of his work and experiences. The webinar is going to be about 40 minutes long. This session is being recorded, so I'll send out follow-up details about how you can access the recording and today's slides. So I think I'll pass on to George now for the presentation. Thank you.
Right, thanks very much, Emily. Hello, everybody. Welcome. I'll just press this. This is my first webinar, so you're going to have to be patient with me. I'd like to just thank in the background Sarah Gadsden and Gerard McCormack from Improvement Service. So this invitation to present to you, I suppose really a bit of my change journey, my organisation's journey, and also I think some of the systemic change that's required around creating a more participative society is something that I've been working with the Improvement Service on for quite a while, actually. So thank you for this opportunity to engage with the Change Managers Network. So we've got up to an hour, and obviously if you're change managers, you've got a lot of work on your plate. I don't know what you did in a former life to have to take responsibility for this. So I'm going to try and keep this as worthwhile and as succinct as I possibly can. So I think if I get up, first of all, this slide. Sure, there we go. All right. What I'm going to do is, over this next period, is focus in on that change journey. One, about myself. Secondly, about my organisation, and thirdly, about, I think, volunteering as a wider system. So to get me started on that, I want to just share with you a little bit of context. The first is about myself. As I was walking into work this morning, I was reflecting a little bit about, right, you know, what is my connection with this thing, volunteering and community participation? And it struck me that I'm of an age to be able to say that 40 years ago, I was working with a tennis association in Northfield in Aberdeen, and that was doing a community work placement. And I have such vivid memories about that, about working with that group around a campaign around saving the bus services to that community. And I suppose, you know, since then, over these 40 years, I've done such a range of different community type of work, you know, including 7 years in Drumchapel. I worked in local authorities for 10 years. I was Public Participation Development Officer in Kilmarnock, and I led up the Priority Partnership Area, one of the 12 in Scotland for North Ayr. So you could say, and I will say, that it's somehow or other, it's in my DNA, that it's what my career is about, and it's what really gets me up in the morning. It gets me to walk into work, not barefooted, I dare to say, despite the image on the screen. And part of that DNA makes me really concerned to try and understand ways in which we can bring about what I regard a feel-good, a well-being benefit. The evidence is really strong about that, through community engagements in all its shapes and forms. So it's something dear to my heart and something I want to share with you some perspective on this morning. If I look at the context for the we, that's the me. The we, for me, the context is Volunteer Scotland. So we're here in Stirling. We've been here over 30 years. We're the National Centre for Volunteering. And there's 40 of us. Half of the staff, excuse me, are tied up more around the enabling role of volunteering into working with vulnerable groups. We access disclosures, we provide support and help and compliance guidance and the likes around that. And then the other 20 of us are a mixture between research and evidence, practice work, and innovation, change, experiment, which I'll say a little bit about later. We're aligned in particular, and I know that you guys have got an awful lot of different touch points around community engagement, Empowerment Act, and a plethora of connections there. Our main one is fairly recent in that the Scottish Government launched their Volunteering for All outcomes framework just about a year ago, and that has provided a really first-class framework for our interventions and collaborations around a real desire to break through the current flatline and in fact slightly reducing participative society that we've been seeing, to create a more inclusive, in particular social class mix being far better than it is just now, and that we generate the benefits from the well-known feelings that people experience through participating with others. So Volunteering for All is our main framework, main reference point. The other I'd like to add for you is that I know there's an awful lot of debate, anorak debate and consideration around what is volunteering, and I don't really want to get into that, to be perfectly honest. However, in 2001, the United Nations, with the International Year of the Volunteer, it did some seminal work about trying to understand and communicate what volunteering was about. And I think it's really significant that they identified three main determinants or elements. The first would be about self-organising and self-help activities, of which we know there are so many. Alcoholics Anonymous is one that immediately comes to mind, about how each of the participants is both gaining support and help, but also providing it in a self-organised kind of fashion. We've then got our more service volunteering, and that in many respects has been the dominant way of thinking about volunteering, and we have to really break into that and change that. But that's where you get all the kind of recruit, retain, the volunteer management, the roles and tasks, and that's where we had actually some problems around definition about unpaid work. And I know that it's one of the issues that you guys also face, about some suspicion about, is volunteering there to provide a substitute, an alternative to paid staff. But in the service side is the area which tends to get problematic around that. I'll say a little bit about that later. And then the last is about campaigning and advocacy. Isn't it brilliant to see Greta and her Friday strikes with young people, and there's no doubt United Nations, where she was, of course, just a week ago, would absolutely recognise that the activities of those young people would be volunteering and recognised as such. And I've got a quick story to share with you that in 2005, Gordon Brown had created the UK Year of the Volunteer, and I was invited to number 11 Downing Street, and he came in, he sort of topped and tailed it, came back at the end of a session. By the way, it was with the White House staff as well. That's another story, I think. When he came back in, he declared that he was so pleased to see that the volunteering rates in the country had increased quite dramatically across the UK. And my colleague sitting next to me whispered, the reason for the increase has been the anti-war protest movement in the UK in this last period, but we didn't have the heart to call him out on that. But I think that's an example really of that side of volunteering as well. So that's the me and the we. The us for me is the Scottish context, and I'm afraid to say that it's really disturbing that we know all the value of volunteering and what it brings, that really first-class evidence about that. And there's nobody really questioning it. But then when we look at the actual participation rates, what we see is that they have what we'd call flatlined for a couple of decades. So in fact, the more recent findings has shown a slight decline from 28% to 26%, Scottish Household Survey. And underlying that, let's say 1 in 4 of our population who are relatively involved, underneath that, the actual hours that people are contributing in all its shapes and forms, including the campaigning and the self-organising side of things, is in decline. And it does vex me somewhat that when you actually look at the hundreds of millions of hours of lost giving of time that's been happening beneath the surface, that there's nobody, no political or wider voice that's really saying this is not acceptable. We're losing well over £1 billion in monetary value if you were to monetize it. They were worth more than the annual oil revenues. So I think there's a big question. If we're all in this same consideration about making our society more participative, then we have got to look really deeply at the fact that it's actually getting less so. And I know it's a complicated matter, but that's one thing that I'm kind of want to share my perspective with you about. Okay, so move on to the next thing then. So I've worked here, funny enough, since that United Nations in 2001. That's when I first started at Volunteer Scotland. So you could forgive me for getting a little bit, let's just say, not fed up, but kind of really concerned not to slide into a kind of familiar comfort pattern of work. So I thought time to really take a bit of time out, and not a lot, 10 weeks, 5 weeks of my own time, 5 weeks of the company's time, to study this question about why were we not more successful in generating more participation. And I had a particular focus, which was about, I don't know if you've come across the public value proposition, which I think is so strong about how our public services, along with our commerce, combine with civic society and citizens to bring about shared outcomes. It seemed to me, having listened to Professor John Bennington at a Solace conference here in Stirling some 10 years ago, that there was so much traction in that, and yet it hadn't taken hold. So what I did over the 10 weeks was I contacted John, and it's a bit of a long story, so I'm going to really shorten it, but just suffice to say that he put me in contact with Professor Jean Hartley at Open University at Milton Keynes, and I learned a wonderful thing, and that was that when you're a chief executive of an organisation, or for that matter anybody else that is on a learning journey, where I sought help to look at concepts, to look at writing, and to meet and interview and observe things when I was on a learning journey, the generosity and the support and help towards me was legend. And some of the relationships established during that study leave are ones that are really dear and really important to me now as I progress in the leadership role that I have here and in the period of time ahead. I had the advantage of being on the Queen's Award for Voluntary Service. I'm on the national panel of that, and I was asked to undertake a bit of review for them during the study leave, and that enabled me then to travel across the UK looking at the different examples of these groups, and at the same time give me an insight into different places. And that brought me to Newcastle and an introduction to the North East Together's Leaders Network for Social Action, which are absolutely wonderful. I think if this webinar goes well, which I hope you're enjoying, then maybe that's something that we could follow up with at a later stage. But at the same time, I learned just by off chance about Bo'ness and the wonderful Bo'ness Children's Fair. And so I went through on a visit. I'd missed the fair itself, but I went through and found out a little bit about it. Now, I'm a bit annoyed with myself, to be honest, that having had 40 years in community participation world, I hadn't known about it. And once I did find out about it, I was gobsmacked by the fact that the whole town, over 100 years, has been connected to this wonderful fair, which I would describe as a mix between Hunger Games and Disney World. Check it out online and you'll see what I mean, and I'm not kidding you on. So this wonderful expression of community combined with my understanding and learning that the first fair was actually a miners' fair. And that first fair arose when the miners won their freedom from what was called the bond system, which was a hated form of servitude of workers to the masters, the maesters. And it was a UK Parliamentary Act that was passed that enabled the miners to win their freedom from this, horrific form of a tie. Even if you were sacked, the master could withhold you from working for anybody else. So they'd won their freedom from that, and they had their miners' fair. And many, many years later, it transformed into the children's fair. So by coincidence, the miners, they kept on popping up in different ways, totally random, in the course of my study leave. And not least, I managed to visit the wonderful Angel of the North, in the northeast there, and Gateshead, Newcastle area, and discovered that it's actually pinned down into coal seams with a mining heritage from the Andy Gormley, wonderful piece of work. So it kind of reconnected me with something I think that I'd lost sight of as my volunteering practice and my organisation and the wider way of communicating about volunteering had become not sanitised, but what I would say is gentrificised, if that's such a word, that I'm afraid to say the discovery for me and the horror to some degree of the considerations I was putting in was to recognise that we'd been losing sight of what was happening at Bo'ness, losing sight of community and unity, and promoting a picture of volunteering which was far more about that role, task, transactional side rather than the relationship side. And in the course of that, I picked up a concept called Habitus by French philosopher Bourdieu. And I read an article about how Habitus had worked in the National Trust volunteers in England. And the penny dropped. What it helped me to see was that the reason why, and I'm not criticising those mainly white, middle class, female volunteers, not at all, because they are absolutely brilliant. But what I'm saying is that the reason why they would end up in the National Trust was that this habitus, almost not preordained, but it orientated themselves towards the world of the language, the connections to heritage, to being confident, familiar, and a natural connection with that kind of role. And then, of course, I'm thinking to myself, what about my friends and community people in Drumchapel? How far would that language and orientation relate to them? And so it helped me to realise that a gentrification process, for lack of any better way of putting it, is what I think has been happening. So when I look at the stats then for Perth and Kinross, what I see in that local authority area is a wonderful, what the BBC would call gregarious middle class. If you check out they've got a BBC class survey for the UK, and there's about 7 different stratifications. So there's a gregarious middle class which is highly engaged and great and absolutely brilliant that they are in all sorts of associational connections and doing things and enjoying that. Over half of that social class are engaged. But then when you look at what BBC are calling the precariat and also the traditional working class, then the figures go right down to below the Scottish national average, which is about 18% down to 15% participation rate. So I don't think, like gentrification itself, I don't think there's an intended process of shifting people out and moving them out and making them less relevant, but I think it's something that has happened. So I then thought to myself, well, if that's the case, then it's about time I better started to get out of my own ivory towers and get to the ground. And I will say that the Open University and the people there, they really did encourage me to turn on the head the notion of public values based on how we, if you like, we are the ones that create the circumstances. We're the leaders that enable our communities to then find the spaces and processes for their engagement. I put it to them, what if we turned that on its head and said, look, the community itself is the place for the leadership that then inspires us and the wider system to work with them in a different fashion. So I put that to them, and I was really surprised they were prepared to go along with it. So I thought, well, okay, put my walk the talk. And so I went out with a colleague and I knocked on 400 doors in 5 different kind of streets. 3 was in Tillicooty, and I went back to Bowness to look at 3 questions. What's your community spirit like here? What might build on that community spirit? You could say there was a 4th question of what maybe was taken away from community spirit, and then the question about and what would you be wanting to do? What would you want to do to contribute? So I can say it was quite a leveler, as you can imagine. You know, knocking on that first door in Tillicooty, quite a cold morning, and thinking, I have no idea what kind of reaction I'm going to get, who I'm going to meet. But here we go. Knocked on that door, and it was a lovely Syrian woman who couldn't speak any English, and but was so kind in actually phoning up her friend who could speak English. It was impossible, though, to actually go through this survey, but we had lots of smiles. I left and carried on, and so I discovered that you would get about 1 in 4 of the doors you knocked on, you would be able to speak to somebody, and there was only about 1 person that wasn't able to actually support the survey. What I discovered for myself on the doorstep was, and it's not scientific, obviously, but what I learned was that there is a real willingness, interest, concern, and looking out for other people in our population out there in these different communities. That came across really strongly, and it was really quite touching. It was also touching to observe the state of play of quite a number of the folk that I spoke to, and that was quite worrying in another sense, just in terms of states of health and isolation, for instance, that came out. But the underlying strength of community spirit and willingness was there. However, when asked the question, were they engaged in anything or what they wanted to do, then I was only about 10% of those that we spoke to that were actually engaged in something. So that does seem to me that there's a massive vacuum and gap between the stated willingness and interest to help and want to contribute, and whether or not, and people's knowledge how to do that, and whether or not they've actually got the experience to do it. So therein lay the thought that people were in a bubble. And so moving on to the concept now of what is a community bubble, I hope I've kind of covered in what I've already said, the notion of communities coming together, the unity of solidarity and camaraderie, and about, if you like, in theoretical terms, looking at social capital, how we can bond and bridge and link. So the idea of a community bubble arose, and could we then take out and create in the gap of experience and the gap of actual participation, could we inhabit that space and find a way in which we could create an icebreaker and a connector to get the conversation started. So we went back to Chapelle Crescent in Tillicooty, which was, let's just say, a hard pressed up against it street. And so we wanted to, we had been invited by those folk that we spoke to at the doorstep to come back. So we came back and we did a kind of cafe thing in the local cafe. And we had 2 workshops. They were great about community spirit and what was working and what not. And so what arose from there, and you see in this photograph that that's the actual bubble itself. There are 2 of them, they connect, they're 5 metre by 5 metre, they're easy to put up, they're air filled, so they go up, they're colourful, they're full of the bonus festivity, if you like. And that day that the group that came together from those 2 cafe sessions were interested in contributing to the Tilly Community Week, and that's what that group were doing. They set up the tent just as to test it, because they were bringing it to the week itself. And lo and behold, a group of people came together. It was brilliant to see it, and I took that photograph because I was really so pleased to see that impromptu excuse me, opportunity for the community to come together. So I'll just take a drink to discuss what they would do for the week. It happened so spontaneously, and they came up with their ideas and they went ahead and did it. The other offshoots of that work was around tenants residence group being re-established, and they met with our MP and MSP and also local councillors around that, about some of the housing issues and concerns, and also another group which was, or not so much a group, but a kind of theme around anti-social conduct and difficulties around drugs abuse and the likes that was really seriously affecting the lives of that street. So they're on a journey, and we've linked them up to community development and Clap Manager, and we're still working with them in support of what they're doing. The next slide, this wonderful woman you see in the middle there is May Barker. The background photograph is actually one of the panels on the community bubble, and this was May over in Brussels with us. And the reason why I want to share this slide with you is that, well, let me think, if I can make a reference to you that the Dutch football have done a wonderful video, an animation called Back to Basics, and it tells a story about what Dutch football volunteering was like 40 years ago, what Dutch society was like, and it also shows you what it needs to be now. And it's the central theme is about the need for connectors, the people that recognise, have the trust, goodwill, the salt of the earth, if you like, that have an ability to understand what people can give and bring it about. So May is one of those wonderful connectors. And in talking to her on the flight over to Brussels, she said to me that she had been to Brussels before and in a trade union delegation to campaign about the loss of European policies at that time and the effect it was having on the clothing industry in the Ochils and in Scotland. So it was great to hear that story, but in the course of that, she also said that in the women's cooperative movement and in their trade union, she'd been taken through a public speaking course. And so in the knowledge of that, when we were in Brussels in the press centre, the slides behind you, or the photograph, is part of a European project called Get Connected. And we had a big launch and exposition about that just about 9 months ago. And of course, May, she spoke about the community bubble and the work we'd been doing and did it so brilliantly. So I think there's something in here about how, in our experience, the community bubble type of approach, that folk like May, they're there and we have to find a way in which we find them and that they can then work their magic in due course. So that's our May. This slide here is the two bubble tents at Stirling's Family Volunteering Day in the local park at Kings Park. And it helps me to share with you another dimension to the work we're doing now, that Stirling Council, along with the TSI and ourselves, were the three partners that went for European Volunteering Capital for Stirling. We'd hope to achieve that next year. We were unsuccessful and Padova in Italy won it through. However, the key to this is that the Council's commitment to bring about a participative community in Stirling to achieve the 50% participation rate. At the moment it's at 38. That we're going to be working over the next 3 years very intensively together, looking at how the bubble and the other festivals and a whole range of different mechanisms, including the targeting of certain neighbourhoods and priority areas for us to work with to overcome the current social class divide that's in play. How all of these things come together in terms of local authority area in Stirling, and be only too pleased to share with you or to engage with any of you if you're interested in some of that work. Okay, this is what we call the bubble talk. This was at Solheim just 2 weeks ago, and how we've used the bubble concept as creating a space for dialogue all around volunteering and inclusion. In that occasion, that's how the TSIs, the volunteer centres, are looking for campaigning for growth. We had engagement with Scottish Bandmate in Scotland, looking at how they are wanting to really generate a lot more social groups and activities around badminton throughout the country. Following, I thought, the wonderful example of Table Tennis Scotland bringing a group of 30 volunteers and their table tennis equipment to the Gyle shopping centre, and now I believe approaching 1,000 people playing table tennis a week there. And I think there's a story around how we can invent community, reinvent community, reinvent possibilities for participating in things in new contexts and in imaginative ways. So how the bubble talk brings about and inspires that kind of thing is important to us. So that brings me on to really towards concluding what I'd like to share with you in this webinar, but to say how all of these things are coming together in what we're calling a Volunteering for All Expo, the first evidence session, which we're going to hold at the gathering, the SCVO gathering on the 19th of February in Glasgow. It will immediately follow the First Minister's breakfast. And at that expo, you can see in the slide, we're asking this question about what comes first, community or volunteering. How, with the evidence that we're going to be sharing that day, how we generate some common purpose, excuse me, between people there, and whether we can inspire each other to actually want to do some work offline and come back to other expos thereafter. In answer to that question about what comes first, community or volunteering, first I'd like to share a really significant piece of research done by NHS, Greater Glasgow and Clyde, 7,000 people surveyed in the 5 local authority areas there. And all of that research will be properly shared on the 19th of February. I just want to highlight one particular stat, and that is that if you're involved in a community group, association, church, club, then it's a 50% likelihood that you will recognize yourself as a volunteer. If you're not involved in some form of community association, then that goes right down to 15%. If you're involved in social action of some form or another, then your volunteer participation rate goes up to 60%. Now, it's a chicken and egg question. My organisational response to it is to say that we're going to take a middle way. And that middle way is not to lose sight of the volunteer practice around that 15%, about the volunteers that are managed and recruited and supported and have to go through disclosures and all that kind of world. That continues and is really of value. But it's a recognition by me in my leadership journey, by my organisation, that in actual fact, the truth of it is that most volunteering has been happening in community associational life and always has done. And we haven't really been paying enough attention to how we support that, recognise it and build it. So that middle way for us is to really recalibrate and to recognise that half of our attention at least needs to go into the community building in all its shapes and forms, activities that can generate the social capital that leads to the well-being through volunteer activity. And perhaps maybe you can just finish off by an example of that in September here we have our Festival of Volunteering, and part of that this year was a festival of photography. So I was invited to that on Friday evening in the Smith Gallery, so the exhibition's on. And what did I discover? That through Janie, the connector, and 7 or 8 volunteers around her, the organisers, they had generated maybe 80 or 100 photographs and photographers who had put forward their photos. About 50 or 60 of them were selected on a theme of hope and passion. They were largely there with their families there on the evening, so there was about 80 people at the thing. And they were from Holland and from Poland, and there was all diversity at play. And it was a fantastic experience, and some connections made by myself and some friendships made to boot. So I think in some senses it's that kind of world that I think is going to be vital for us and for us all as we progress. So I think that's me taking up about 3/4 of the session, And I'd like now just to open up to Emily in particular to maybe guide me on any of the chat or any of the questions or further exploration. So thank you for listening.
Right, thank you very much, George, for sharing your experiences and your stories. So as George said, we are now open to questions. Please use the grey chat box on your screens to type in your questions and send them through, and we'll kind of facilitate that session. I guess the first thing, you talked quite a lot about community bubbles, so it might just be useful for the attendees to know how they can find out about upcoming community bubble sessions, how they can sign up.
Yeah, okay. Thank you for that, Emily. I should have said that what comes with the community bubble is a community bubble network. So if anybody is interested in either using the bubble or finding out about it, then I've put my email there. You can simply write to me or give me a phone. So the bubble, we are making it available free of charge to anybody that wants to utilise it. There can be a little bit of transport costs or whatever, depending on the circumstances, but largely we want to make it available. And anybody that's face-to-face contact with it then becomes part of the community bubble network. And so, for instance, we've got a local radio station that's been part of it, and we've got the Open University that are about to use it in their 50th anniversary celebrations coming up. So what we're saying is that that network includes Open University, the radio station, the Chappelle Crescent, and all the different groups that have already been involved, and that we are going to have some software, which is Team Kinetic, that is going to allow people to interact and also to share and maybe provide some mutual support. So it's very ad hoc, it's very generative, it's network theory, if you like. And my invitation to any of you is that if you want to connect with it, there's an open door.
Thank you very much. I would recommend if you can go along, please do. I've been along to one of these sessions, so it was great. A little bit about staff resistance. So we've heard of a situation where you have core staff and you have volunteers, and at that point core staff start to feel a little bit threatened, or there's a little bit of fear that their jobs will end up getting replaced by the volunteers. So can you touch a little bit on that, please?
Yeah, definitely. I think that this has come very much to the fore this last couple of years in particular, because of some of the controversies that have arisen. The one that comes to my mind was that the Hogmanay Party in Edinburgh, organised by Underbelly 2 years ago, generated a storm of protest about how the year before the the street champions and well, I forget what they were actually asked to do to help chaperone the party had been paid, and now they were looking for 250 volunteers. And what I thought was really fascinating about that controversy was that it was better than zero, younger population of volunteers that were saying, look at our circumstances and the precarious working conditions that many are facing. And in that context, it's just not legitimate or acceptable to us that you're creating these volunteer positions without pay. And it's a long story, but they won the main argument on that, and there was a change. And that then generated a re-engagement of us and myself with the STUC and other unions to review the charter, the volunteering charter, for good relations excuse me, between staff and volunteers. I've got it actually here. It's on our website. I can try and find, this is where, here we go. So this is the charter that you would find. And to me, Emily, I think it is I would say this, wouldn't I? I think it's excellent in terms of creating a balanced view about what volunteering is about, and then it takes you through the 10 principles that really help to find legitimacy in whatever context that you're in. So Stirling Council have adopted it, Solheim Cup adopted it, Euros 2020 have adopted it, and many others, because it's a way of guiding people through the decision-making process to ensure that you don't move into territory which is displacement, but at the same time you recognise that, for instance, at Solheim, there's a large number of marshals and so on that they love what they're doing. It's perfectly legitimate and fine, and they did it and they enjoyed it. But at Ryder Cup, they overstepped the mark by having shop assistants that were volunteers. So Solheim recognised that that would be a breach of the charter. They've continued to have their marshals, but that the shop assistant type of role was discarded, and we've moved on. So I would just suggest to your colleagues that the charter is there for you, and it can help you navigate through some of these issues.
Perfect, thank you very much, George. I think the charter is available on the Volunteer Scotland website, so I'll include that in the follow-up email.
Okay.
I guess you mentioned council commitments, so this next bit relates to that. So we have an example from a lady who litter picks, and the council, the local authority, also sends out a team that basically does the exact same job. So can we get some of your views on how can we manage that better and avoid duplication of work and have a more joined up approach between the volunteers and the local authority?
Yeah, I don't know what that brings to my mind. Excuse me. Remember all these years ago, 5 or 6 years ago, when it was the really terrible winters, almost back to back. I remember the carry on we had about why were people not cleaning up and getting rid of the ice, and it was horrendous. And I think I take some heart from the fact that I think now councils have, in many places now, worked out they create the circumstances where the equipment and the guidance is there and what to do. So you get this kind of collaborative, cooperative set of circumstances where people know what they can do, where the salt and all that is, and they've got the permission, if you like, and the guidance to go about and do it. And that's maybe what I would suggest. That I've seen research, for instance, in Canada, which is about how the recycling bins, when they put them out, that they had a volunteer program which did the door knocking and helped people to understand how to use the new system and what. And they had a far greater success rate in the utilisation of that when they did that. So I don't know if I've got the exact answer for you in terms of that litter one, but I think there's no question that local authorities have got a trusted position, this connection with our communities to enable them, to guide them about how to work together around issues like litter or emergency situations like ice, or even how to better utilise recycling and so on. So I think you've got to work out a kind of leadership perspective from them towards their citizens, I think, in that circumstance.
Thanks, George. The next bit, a little bit about volunteer expectations. So again, a situation where, for example, volunteers are brought in for a fixed term, so 6 months or 6 weeks, or so what happens after that if they're keen to stay on and do more, but perhaps at that time there isn't that much to do and they have to let them go. So how can that be managed?
Okay, I think it's a really interesting question, that, because what I think helps to show is that our willingness of people to give of themselves, especially when they're asked to do something and connect, is extraordinarily large. The current system, though, the problem is that the system is not geared up to bring it about. And so we've got, excuse me, we've got 3/4 of our population who don't have anything to talk about, no experience of directly being participative and involved in things. So I turn it on its head, that one, Emily, and say that it's the weakness of our capacity to engage people that's the problem. And if let's say, if people have got expectations, which is, how can I give more of my time to the community good, then surely we should be the ones that look at ourselves to say, how can we help to bring that about? And there's umpteen examples out there in the charity sector and so on, where, like for instance in the environment, where they're well on record in saying we simply don't have the resources to actually help to bring about the interest that people have got in volunteering. So because we don't have the resources, we're turning people away quite a bit. So to my mind, I think let's look at turning that, the other side of the coin. Let's just see whether or not we can actually change our expectations rather than try and address what comes across as like it's a problem for us that people want to give more of their time that we can't meet. So let's see if we can do something about that one. So I was getting pinging and popping and things like that there, so it kind of distracted me a little bit there. Don't know what all the sound effects were.
No, don't worry. Thank you for that. A little bit more about hard to reach people. So maybe some of the methods or channels that in your experience that work well, or maybe what doesn't work so well. That's something we've come across of how do we get to hard to reach people, or for example, if someone thinks I don't have the right skills to volunteer, then how can we get people like that to come forward?
Well, I think this cuts to the heart of excuse me, what I was saying earlier on, Emily, that if I'm right in suggesting that there's a kind of gentrification process that's underway, then it's no surprise that we would articulate that as we've got a population that are hard to reach. And again, I would suggest we have to turn that completely on its head as well. I know I've read a report about what works Scotland, really, really good. And what they say, what they call it, is that easy to ignore. It's not hard to reach. It's people that are easy to ignore. It's a seminal piece of work. It's really well worth reading, because there's a lot of guidance in it as well. So I think that my door knock and everything else was an attempt by myself to actually understand what people are saying, what makes sense to them. And the bubble, by definition, doesn't come trying to entice somebody to do something for us. It starts off by an encouragement for people to come together and talk and find common ground through their own language and their own contexts and what's important to them, to then discover whether or not there's something there that they would like to follow up on. And so the Chapelle Crescent example is just that who could have foretold that it would be the community festival, antisocial work, or the barbecue that they're planning. That was entirely through that dialogue. So we've got a lot of work to do, and it's really going to be quite tough, because I think a lot of people have been left out. So I think there's a humbling process at play in here as well, about how perhaps we reflect a little bit more on our own role in creating the circumstances where people are not being listened to or engaged in ways that are meaningful to them. Did that sound like a politician's answer? Don't know if I really got to the nub of what you were looking for, so sorry about that.
No, I think that's been really useful. I think we've got a couple of minutes left, so if there's any kind of last minute burning questions, if you could send them through the chat box again. So just at this point, just to cover that, I'll send a follow-up email and I'll include George's details, the slides from today, the link to the recording, which will be on the Improvement Service YouTube channel, and obviously George mentioned the charter, so I'll include that in the email. as well. So is there anything else, George, you would like to add just at the end?
No, I think just reiterate that the Expo on the 19th of February is a really good opportunity for meeting any of the group here, and also just if you're interested in advancing some of the thinking and opportunities to come together ourselves around some of these matters, then I would just promote that and hope to see you there. Yeah.
Perfect. Thank you very much for taking the time to present, George, and thanks to everyone who's joined us today. So keep an eye out for the follow-up email and hope you'll have a nice day. So thank you.
Thank you very much. Pleasure.